Imagine for a moment that right in front of us, within reach, within pages we could open any day, there exists a hidden guide, an ancient source of wisdom that has quietly waited through centuries. Yet so many people overlook it, or worse, underestimate its power. What if the answers to life's deepest questions were not scattered across thousands of modern books, podcasts, and motivational speeches, but preserved in one timeless source? Minds picture a book that speaks directly to the questions every human heart eventually asks. How should I live? Who can I trust? What path leads to real peace? Where can I find purpose that doesn't fade when life becomes difficult? This is not a modern self-help manual promising quick success or temporary motivation. It is something far older, far deeper, and far more powerful. It is the Book of Proverbs, an ancient collection of wisdom that believers have long understood to be inspired by God Himself. 2. But Proverbs is not simply a list of clever sayings meant to decorate greeting cards or appear in inspirational quotes online. It reaches far deeper than that. It pulls back the curtain on everyday life and reveals the hidden consequences of the choices we make. It shows us the invisible paths that stretch out before us, one leading toward life, peace, and fulfillment, and the other toward regret, confusion, and destruction. Many people treat Proverbs as pleasant advice, perhaps a collection of wise observations that sound nice but belong to another era. Yet what if these words are more than advice? What if they are spiritual insights designed to reshape the foundation of our lives? Proverbs was never meant to give us a moment of inspiration that fades by tomorrow morning. It was meant to transform the way we think, the way we speak, the way we make decisions, and even the way we see ourselves in relation to God. These words were written to bring our hearts into alignment with eternal truth. They were meant to guide us through the hardest questions of life with strength, clarity, and grace. If someone truly wanted to build a life on something solid, something unshakable, they could begin every morning not with another motivational video or a stream of fleeting advice, but with the wisdom preserved in these ancient verses, words that do more than encourage us. They draw us closer to God, the true source of all understanding. As we begin exploring these teachings, imagine allowing each insight to sink deeper than the surface. Proverbs is not meant to be rushed through. Each verse is like a seed, small, simple, and easily overlooked. But when planted in the heart, it has the power to grow into something life-changing. By the time a person truly absorbs its wisdom, they begin to see the world differently. Decisions become clearer. Priorities shift. Life itself starts to look different through the lens of God's wisdom. So, settle in for a journey through one of the most profound books ever written. A journey that may challenge assumptions, inspire reflection, and, if embraced, reshape the way a person lives. And if these truths resonate, they are not meant to be kept to oneself. Wisdom in Proverbs was always meant to be shared, passed from one life to another, like a light in a dark world, calling people back to truth and strength found only in God. To understand the depth of Proverbs, we have to step back in time and ask a simple but important question: what exactly is this book? At first glance, it may appear to be a collection of wise sayings, practical tips about life, relationships, work, and character. But Proverbs is far more than that. It is not merely an ancient handbook of life advice or a list of moral guidelines gathered by philosophers. It is a divinely inspired guide for living a life rooted in truth, humility, and honor before God. The words of Proverbs were never meant to sit quietly on a shelf gathering dust. They are alive with meaning, inviting readers to see life more clearly and understand the deeper currents that shape human behavior and destiny. They reveal the patterns of wisdom woven into the fabric of the world by its creator. Tradition holds that much of Proverbs was written by King Solomon, the son of King David. Solomon is remembered throughout history as one of the wisest men who ever lived. But his wisdom did not originate from his own brilliance. When Solomon first became king of Israel, God offered him anything he desired: wealth, power, long life, or victory over enemies. Yet Solomon asked for something unexpected. He asked for wisdom. He asked God to give him a discerning heart, so he could govern his people well and distinguish between right and wrong. That humble request pleased God so deeply that Solomon was granted wisdom beyond any king before or after him. His reputation spread across nations. Rulers and scholars traveled great distances simply to hear him speak. Proverbs is a glimpse into that extraordinary wisdom, a collection of insights from a man who had been given divine understanding. Yet Proverbs is not ultimately about Solomon. It is about the Spirit of God speaking through these words, offering guidance that reaches directly into the human soul. Each proverb is remarkably short, often just a single sentence, yet packed with meaning. They are like seeds capable of transforming the heart from the inside out if they are allowed to take root. What makes Proverbs remarkable is its timelessness. The world has changed dramatically since the days of ancient Israel, but the struggles of the human heart remain the same. People still wrestle with pride and anger, greed and temptation, relationships and integrity, trust and fear. Proverbs addresses all of these issues with startling clarity. It teaches how to live with integrity when dishonesty seems easier. It shows how to choose friends wisely and guard the heart against destructive influences. It speaks about money, relationships, anger, humility, and the discipline of daily life. Yet beyond all these practical matters lies a deeper message. Wisdom is not simply about making better decisions. It is about learning to see life through God's perspective. And at the very center of Proverbs lies a powerful and somewhat surprising truth. True wisdom does not begin with knowledge, intelligence, or experience. It begins with something the Bible calls the fear of the Lord. The phrase might sound strange at first. Fear usually brings to mind anxiety or terror. But the fear of the Lord described in Proverbs is something very different. It is a deep reverence, a profound awareness of who God truly is. It is the recognition that we stand before a Creator who is infinitely greater than we can comprehend. Solomon himself wrote in Proverbs that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, while fools despise wisdom. To understand these words, it helps to remember Solomon's own life. He was not just a philosopher, writing theories about wisdom. He was a king who experienced both the heights of success and the consequences of losing sight of God. Months early in his reign, Solomon sought God's guidance above everything else. But later in life, his heart became divided. Surrounded by wealth, political alliances, and foreign influences, he drifted from the very foundation of wisdom he had once celebrated. The Book of Ecclesiastes, another work attributed to Solomon, reveals his later reflections. After pursuing pleasure, knowledge, power, and wealth, he concluded that without God, all of it was meaningless. Months in the end, he returned to the truth he had known from the beginning. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. The fear of the Lord places everything in its rightful order. It reminds us that we are not the center of the universe. God is. It humbles the human heart and makes it teachable. When a person understands that their knowledge is limited compared to God's wisdom, they become open to learning, correction, and truth. Ancient wisdom literature outside the traditional canon echoes this idea as well. In the Book of Sirach, Preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox Bible, wisdom is described as something created alongside the faithful, growing within those who seek God with reverence. It is not something achieved through human effort alone, but a gift given to those who approach God with humility. Munda, imagine standing before the throne of the Creator, sensing the vastness of His power and holiness. That sense of awe is what Proverbs calls the beginning of wisdom. It is not fear that pushes us away from God, but reverence that draws us closer to Him. Yet, Solomon's life also stands as a warning. Even the wisest person can lose their way when they forget this foundation. His story reminds us that wisdom is not a one-time achievement, but a lifelong commitment to remain rooted in reverence for God. And Proverbs then moves from the foundation of wisdom into the everyday realities of life, including something every human being experiences: relationships. According to Proverbs, relationships are never casual or insignificant. Every person we allow into our lives shapes us in ways we may not immediately notice. Each influence becomes a thread woven into the fabric of our character. The people we walk beside can draw us closer to wisdom or pull us toward destruction. Solomon knew this better than most. As a king, he was surrounded by advisors, diplomats, soldiers, servants, and foreign leaders. Choosing the right voices to listen to was essential for the stability of his kingdom. In the early years of his reign, Solomon surrounded himself with wise counsel, people who encouraged his desire to follow God and rule with justice. But over time, those influences changed. Political alliances and foreign marriages brought voices into his life that slowly led him away from the path of faithfulness. Proverbs captures the lesson he learned through experience. Walk with the wise and become wise. But a companion of fools suffers harm. Relationships, according to Proverbs, are never neutral. They either strengthen our character or weaken it. A wise friend is not simply someone who agrees with us or makes us feel comfortable. Sometimes a true friend challenges us, corrects us, and pushes us toward growth. There is a famous proverb that says iron sharpens iron, and one person sharpens another. The image is vivid. When two blades sharpen each other, friction is required, sparks fly. In the same way, real friendships are not built on flattery but on truth. They refine us. Solomon's life, again, becomes an illustration. Imagine him as a young king listening to advisors who urged him to remain humble before God. Those voices likely strengthened him in the beginning, but imagine later years when those voices were replaced by individuals who valued power and influence more than faithfulness. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the direction of his life changed. Proverbs asks a question every reader must eventually face. Who are you walking with? Who is shaping your thoughts, your habits, your character? Because the people closest to us do far more than fill our time. They shape our future. And just as relationships shape our lives, so do the words we speak. The wisdom of Proverbs does not stop with relationships. It moves even deeper into something every person uses every single day, often without thinking about it: words. Speech feels ordinary, almost invisible, yet Proverbs treats it with enormous seriousness. In the eyes of God, words are never small or insignificant. They carry weight, they carry power. They carry consequences that can ripple through lives long after the moment they are spoken. Solomon wrote that the tongue has the power of life and death, and those who love it will eat its fruit. That statement alone reveals how seriously the book treats human speech. Words are not simply sounds that vanish into the air. They are seeds planted in the hearts of others. Some grow into encouragement, healing, and hope. Others grow into pain, division, and destruction. Solomon understood this truth from experience. As a king, a single decree from his mouth could establish peace in a region or send armies into battle. His words shaped laws, settled disputes, and guided an entire nation. Yet the principle in Proverbs goes far beyond kings and leaders. Every person holds this same power in their daily conversations, with family, with friends, with strangers, even with themselves. Lane, think for a moment about a time when someone's words deeply affected you. Perhaps it was a sentence spoken in encouragement when you felt ready to give up. Maybe it was a careless remark that stayed with you for years. Proverbs reminds us that words travel further than we realize. They create echoes that reach far beyond the moment they leave our lips. One proverb compares reckless speech to a sword. It says the words of the reckless pierce like swords, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. The image is powerful. A sword is designed to wound, to cut deeply. In the same way, harsh words can leave scars that cannot be seen but are felt for years. Yet in contrast, wise words can restore what is broken. They can calm fear, repair relationships, and bring peace where conflict once lived. Pondered. Meand. There is another insight that feels almost painfully relevant to everyday life. Proverbs teaches that a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Anyone who has lived long enough has seen this truth play out. One response can escalate a disagreement into a full conflict, while a calm and thoughtful reply can diffuse tension before it grows. Solomon likely witnessed countless disputes during his reign, disagreements between citizens, arguments between leaders, conflicts that threatened the unity of the kingdom. Through those experiences, the difference between peace and chaos often came down to the way people chose their words. Tantalin. Even the New Testament later echoes this wisdom. In the letter of James, the tongue is compared to the rudder of a ship. A rudder is tiny compared to the massive vessel it steers, yet that small piece determines the entire direction of the ship. In the same way, our words steer the direction of our lives and the lives of those around us. Bandias. Imagine asking Solomon what the true mark of wisdom looks like. He might not speak first about intelligence, knowledge, or education. He might simply say this: guard your tongue. Because wisdom is often revealed not in what a person knows, but in how they choose to speak. Genda. Proverbs also offers a beautiful picture of the positive side of speech. It says, gracious words are like a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and healing to the bones. In ancient Israel, honey was precious. It was rare, nourishing, and valued not only for sweetness, but also for its healing qualities. By comparing wise speech to honeycomb, Proverbs suggests that words can nourish the human spirit. Many a kind sentence spoken at the right moment can lift a weary heart. A thoughtful conversation can restore someone who feels broken. Words can carry encouragement like a gift. Yet in a world that often encourages speaking impulsively, saying whatever comes to mind without restraint, Proverbs calls for something different. It invites us to treat words as sacred tools, instruments capable of carrying God's wisdom and love into the lives of others. But Proverbs does not only address relationships in speech, it also steps directly into areas that dominate much of human life, work, wealth, and the pursuit of success. In modern culture, these subjects are often framed in terms of ambition, status, and financial achievement. Success is frequently measured by income, possessions, and influence. Yet Proverbs approaches the subject with a completely different perspective. Work and wealth are not treated as goals in themselves. Instead, they are opportunities to reflect God's character through diligence, responsibility, and faithfulness. Solomon writes that lazy hands make for poverty, but diligent hands bring wealth. At first glance, this might seem like simple career advice, but the deeper message is about character. Work is not just a means to earn money. It is a reflection of the attitude of the heart. Solomon himself was one of the wealthiest rulers in history. His kingdom experienced extraordinary prosperity. Yet despite that wealth, he repeatedly warned about the dangers that accompany money when it is pursued without wisdom. One of the most memorable lessons he gives comes from a surprisingly small creature, the ant. Proverbs invites the reader to observe the ant carefully. It says to go to the ant and consider its ways. Despite having no commander or overseer, the ant works diligently, storing provisions during seasons of abundance to prepare for the future. The image is almost poetic. A king surrounded by unimaginable wealth, pointing to a tiny insect as a teacher of wisdom. The ant does not work only when someone is watching. It does not labor only when reward is immediate. It quietly prepares, planning for tomorrow through steady effort today. Proverbs asks readers to consider whether their own approach to work reflects that same diligence. Are we working only for short-term satisfaction? Or are we building something meaningful through consistent effort? Another powerful warning appears in Proverbs regarding debt. Solomon writes that the borrower is slave to the lender. In ancient times, this could be literally true, as unpaid debts sometimes led to servitude. But the principle remains strikingly relevant even today. Debt can quietly become a form of bondage. When people spend beyond their means, chasing possessions or experiences they cannot afford, they often trade freedom for obligation. Proverbs distinct in dim wealth, etc., but it warns against the mindset that treats money as the ultimate goal of life. Instead, it encourages a different path, one marked by contentment, discipline, and generosity. There is a remarkable paradox presented in these teachings. Proverbs says that one person gives freely and gains even more, while another withholds excessively and comes to poverty. A generous person will prosper, and whoever refreshes others will themselves be refreshed. At first glance, this seems backwards. The world often tells us to hold tightly to what we have, to accumulate more and more in order to feel secure. Yet Proverbs presents generosity as a divine principle. Those who give freely often experience a deeper kind of wealth, peace, joy, and spiritual abundance that money alone can never provide. When wealth is viewed as a gift entrusted by God, rather than something owned entirely by ourselves, it changes how we handle it. Work becomes an act of stewardship. Money becomes a tool for blessing others rather than a measure of personal worth. And beyond work, wealth, relationships, and words, Proverbs points towards something even deeper, something that shapes every decision we make and every path we walk. It calls this foundation integrity. Integrity is not simply about avoiding wrongdoing. According to Proverbs, it is the bedrock of a life that truly honors God. It means living with consistency between what we believe, what we say, and what we do. Solomon writes that whoever walks in integrity walks securely, but whoever takes crooked paths will be found out. The message is simple yet profound. When a person lives honestly, there is a deep sense of stability. There is nothing to hide, nothing to constantly defend. Life becomes straightforward. But when someone builds their life on deception or manipulation, they must constantly protect the illusion they have created. Eventually, the truth surfaces. Integrity was something Solomon himself had to learn through experience. Early in his reign, he was known for wisdom and justice. Yet, over time, he faced temptations that come with power and influence. The temptation to compromise truth for convenience, to bend principles for Proverbs reflects the lessons of those struggles. Integrity, Solomon realized, is not a single decision made once in life. It is a daily commitment to walk in alignment with truth. To live with integrity is to be whole, undivided. It means the same character exists in private and in public. It means our actions match our words, and our motives reflect honesty rather than hidden agendas. In a world where shortcuts, manipulation, and half-truths often seem to succeed, Proverbs calls people to a higher standard. Integrity acts like a compass, guiding us through temptation and uncertainty. Even when honesty comes at a cost, Proverbs assures that the long-term reward far outweighs the temporary loss. A life built on integrity leaves something far more valuable than wealth. It leaves a legacy. Solomon writes that the righteous who walk in integrity leave a blessing for their children after them. In other words, integrity does not only affect the present moment. It shapes the future of families, communities, and generations yet to come. Imagine passing down not just possessions, but a reputation for honesty, kindness, and faithfulness. A name that carries respect because it represents character. This kind of life becomes like a light shining in darkness. Proverbs describes the path of the righteous as the morning sun, growing brighter and brighter until the full light of day. And yet, even with all these teachings about wisdom, speech, relationships, work, and integrity, Proverbs continues to reveal another surprising truth about the human heart, one that can quietly undermine all the rest. That truth revolves around pride and humility. As the wisdom of Proverbs unfolds, it eventually arrives at one of the most surprising and challenging truths in the entire book. After speaking about relationships, words, work, wealth, and integrity, it reveals something deeper that quietly shapes every human heart. Pride and humility blend again and again. Proverbs presents a paradox that feels almost upside down compared to the values of the world. In many cultures, strength is associated with confidence, self-promotion, and the ability to rise above others. Success is often measured by how high someone climbs and how much recognition they receive. But Proverbs tells a very different story. According to its wisdom, true greatness is not found in pride, but in humility. One of the most well-known verses in the entire book captures this truth in a single line. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. It sounds simple, but the meaning runs deep. Pride is not just a personality flaw or a moment of arrogance. It is a force that quietly reshapes the human heart, slowly pushing a person away from wisdom and toward downfall. King Solomon himself is perhaps the most powerful example of this principle. When his story began, he stood before God with remarkable humility. Offered anything he desired, Solomon asked not for wealth or power, but for wisdom. That humble request changed the course of his life and the history of his kingdom. God granted him extraordinary understanding, and his fame spread across the ancient world. But pride rarely arrives suddenly. It often grows slowly, almost invisibly. As Solomon's wealth expanded and his kingdom flourished, success surrounded him. His influence stretched across nations. His palaces grew magnificent. His wisdom became legendary. Yet, somewhere along the way, the humility that once defined him began to fade. The very king who had once declared that the fear of the Lord was the beginning of wisdom eventually allowed pride, comfort, and worldly influence to pull his heart in another direction. His life illustrates something Proverbs warns about repeatedly. Pride can thrive beneath the surface of success. It can hide behind achievements and recognition until it quietly leads a person away from the very wisdom that once guided them. Proverbs later summarizes the lesson with another powerful statement. When pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom. From God's perspective, pride is dangerous because it blinds us. It convinces us that we already know enough, that we no longer need guidance, correction, or help. Pride builds a wall between the human heart and the wisdom God wants to give. Humility, on the other hand, does the opposite. It keeps a person teachable. A humble heart remains open to learning, open to correction, and open to the possibility that God's understanding is far greater than our own. Proverbs teaches that humility is not weakness. It is the doorway to deeper wisdom. Minda. Another verse echoes this truth in a striking way, saying that God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. That statement reveals something profound about the nature of humility. It is not merely about thinking less of oneself or pretending to be insignificant. True humility is recognizing reality, that our lives, abilities, and opportunities are ultimately gifts from God. When a person understands this, pride begins to lose its grip. Achievements no longer become reasons for self-glorification, but opportunities to serve others and honor the one who provided them. Ancient wisdom outside the traditional biblical canon echoes the same idea. In the Book of Sirach, another work treasured in certain Christian traditions, a similar instruction appears: the greater you are, the more you must humble yourself. The message feels counterintuitive, yet it reflects a deep spiritual principle. The higher a person rises in influence or success, the more important humility becomes. Without humility, success can quickly distort a person's sense of identity. Pride convinces them that they are the source of their own greatness, but humility keeps their perspective anchored in truth. Proverbs also warns about a particularly subtle form of pride, being wise in one's own eyes. At first glance, this might sound like confidence, but the book presents it as something far more dangerous. It says that when a person becomes convinced of their own wisdom, they close themselves off from learning. Correction becomes an insult rather than an opportunity. Advice is dismissed. Growth stops. Once that happens, wisdom can no longer enter. The book even goes so far as to say, there is more hope for a fool than for someone who believes they already know everything. It is a startling statement, yet it captures the essence of humility. Wisdom requires openness. It requires the willingness to admit that we still have more to learn. The teachings of Proverbs eventually find their fullest expression in the life of Jesus in the New Testament. Jesus embodied humility in a way that transformed the meaning of greatness itself. Though he possessed divine authority, he chose the role of a servant. Rather than seeking power and status, he lowered himself, caring for the overlooked and sacrificing his life for others. His life demonstrated the ultimate victory of humility over pride. The path that appeared weak in the eyes of the world became the path through which redemption entered human history. Proverbs encourages readers to reflect on their own hearts in light of these truths. Pride can appear in subtle forms: self-reliance, the desire for recognition, or the belief that our plans and opinions are always correct. It can show up in the refusal to listen, the resistance to correction, or the quiet assumption that we no longer need guidance. Humility, however, opens a different path. It allows a person to walk through life with a posture of learning rather than control. It invites them to rely not solely on their own understanding, but on the wisdom of God. This leads to one of the most famous and beloved passages in all of Proverbs, a passage that captures the heart of what the book ultimately teaches. It says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight." These words reveal the final step in the journey of wisdom. After recognizing the power of relationships, the influence of words, the importance of diligence, the value of integrity, and the necessity of humility, Proverbs points towards something even deeper: complete trust in God. The world often celebrates independence and self-sufficiency. People are encouraged to rely on their own instincts, build their own paths, and trust their own judgment above all else. But Proverbs challenges that idea. It reminds us that human understanding is limited. Even the wisest person cannot see the entire picture. We cannot fully predict the consequences of every decision or foresee every twist in the road ahead. That is why Solomon urges readers not to lean entirely on their own understanding. Trusting God is not about abandoning thought or responsibility. It is about recognizing that divine wisdom surpasses human perspective. It means inviting God into every decision, every plan, and every direction in life. When Proverbs speaks of acknowledging God in all our ways, it is describing a life that continually turns toward Him for guidance, not just in moments of crisis, but in everyday choices, not just in spiritual matters, but in work, relationships, finances, and dreams. The promise attached to this trust is remarkable. It says that when we acknowledge God in our paths, He will make those paths straight. This does not mean life will become easy or free of difficulty. Rather, it means that God provides direction. He removes confusion and leads us toward the purpose He has prepared. Self-reliance can feel empowering at first. It offers the illusion of control and independence. But Proverbs warns that relying entirely on ourselves eventually leads to trouble. Another verse states plainly that those who trust in themselves are fools, but those who walk in wisdom are kept safe. The message is not meant as an insult, but as a wake-up call. It reminds us that wisdom begins with humility and grows through trust in God. Imagine living with that kind of trust, approaching each day not as a battle to control every outcome, but as a journey guided by a wisdom far greater than our own. Imagine making decisions with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing we are not navigating life alone. This is the invitation Proverbs extends to every reader. It does not simply offer advice for improving behavior or achieving success. It calls people into a deeper relationship with the Creator, a life shaped by reverence, wisdom, humility, and trust. And as these ancient words continue to unfold, they reveal something even more remarkable: that wisdom itself is not just an idea or a collection of teachings. In the final chapters of Proverbs, wisdom is described almost like a living voice calling out to humanity, inviting everyone who will listen to discover the life that God intended from the very beginning. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a vast, dense forest, just before a storm begins to roll in. The sky darkens, the wind stirs the trees, and before you stretches a maze of twisting paths, disappearing into shadows. Somewhere beyond that forest lies the destination you seek, but there is no clear road, no signs, no map in your hands. At first, you may feel confident enough to step forward. You choose a direction, trusting your instincts, hoping your sense of direction will guide you through. For a while it might work. You may walk confidently along a trail, believing you are heading the right way. But the deeper you move into the forest, the more confusing the paths become. Trails split into smaller trails. Some circle back on themselves. Others vanish entirely beneath fallen leaves and tangled branches. Eventually, you arrive at a place where your own judgment is no longer enough. That is the picture Proverbs quietly paints about life. The wisdom of the book reminds us that human understanding can only carry us so far. We can make decisions, form plans, and follow our own sense of direction. But sooner or later, we reach moments where our vision fails us. The path ahead becomes uncertain, and that is where the wisdom of God enters the story. Proverbs teaches that God is like the map we never had in our hands at the beginning of the journey. He sees the entire forest from above, the winding paths, the hidden dangers, the cliffs we cannot see until we are already too close. When we acknowledge Him, when we surrender our plans and allow Him to guide us, our steps are no longer random wanderings through uncertainty. They become part of a path directed with purpose and precision. Solomon expressed this beautifully when he wrote that in their hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. Those words capture the mystery of God's guidance. Human beings dream, plan, and set goals. We imagine the direction our lives should take. Yet beyond our planning, there is a deeper wisdom, quietly shaping the road before us. It does not mean our efforts are meaningless. Planning and striving are part of our responsibility. But Solomon reminds us that behind the scenes there is a divine hand guiding the journey, sometimes leading us in ways we never expected. And trusting God, however, is not something passive. It is not simply waiting and doing nothing. It requires something far more difficult: surrender. It requires laying down our pride, releasing our desperate need to control every outcome, and opening our hearts to the direction of God. Another proverb echoes this truth with striking clarity. Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. Think about that for a moment. Every person carries dreams, ambitions, and carefully designed plans for the future. Yet Proverbs gently reminds us that God's purpose moves deeper than our desires. Sometimes what we want seems right in the moment. Sometimes our plans appear perfect from our limited perspective. But God's wisdom reaches far beyond the present moment. He sees the outcomes we cannot see, the lessons we have yet to learn, and the ways our lives can be shaped into something greater than we imagined. The ancient story of Job offers another powerful window into this truth. Job was a man who experienced suffering so intense that it shattered everything he thought he understood about life. Wealth disappeared, family was lost, and his world collapsed into pain and confusion. Yet even in the midst of that darkness, Job discovered something profound. He came to realize that wisdom and power belong entirely to God. Human beings may struggle to understand the reasons behind suffering or hardship, but God's understanding reaches beyond our questions. Job's journey reveals that trusting God does not mean we always understand every detail of what is happening. Instead, it means believing that God's wisdom is sufficient to carry us through even when the path seems impossible to explain. When we truly surrender our lives to God's guidance, something remarkable begins to happen inside us. Proverbs describes a kind of peace that self-reliance can never produce. It says that when you lie down, you will not be afraid. Your sleep will be sweet. At first, this might sound like a simple promise about rest, but it reaches deeper than physical sleep. It describes a freedom from the anxiety that comes from trying to control everything ourselves. When we trust God completely, we release the burden of constantly worrying about whether we have made the perfect decision or chosen the perfect path. And the heart begins to rest. That peace becomes a quiet confidence that even when life feels uncertain, our steps are still being guided. Proverbs invites every reader to ask an honest question. Are we truly trusting God with all our hearts? Or are we still clinging to our own understanding? It challenges us to examine the hidden places in our lives where we continue to rely on our own wisdom rather than seeking God's direction. Imagine what life would feel like if that trust became complete. Think about how many worries would fade away if we genuinely believed that God was directing our steps, that His plans were wiser than ours, and that He knew our needs even better than we do. Members, the promise Proverbs offers is simple but powerful. When we trust God, He makes our paths straight. That does not mean life becomes easy or free of trials. The road may still include hardship, uncertainty, and moments of struggle, but those moments are no longer meaningless. Every challenge becomes part of a larger purpose. Munja. Solomon continues this encouragement by reminding readers not to be wise in their own eyes. Instead, he calls them to fear the Lord and turn away from evil. According to Proverbs, this kind of humility brings health to the body and nourishment to the bones. In other words, trusting God does not only affect our spiritual life. It touches every part of who we are, our emotions, our physical well-being, and the way we experience the world around us. But Proverbs does not stop with guidance and trust. As the wisdom unfolds, it begins to address something deeply human: anger. Danger is one of the most powerful emotions a person can experience. It can rise suddenly, sparked by injustice, betrayal, frustration, or pain. Sometimes anger feels justified, even necessary. Yet Proverbs warns that when anger is left unchecked, it can quickly become a destructive force. Solomon once wrote something that may surprise many readers. He said that a patient person is better than a warrior, and someone who has self-control is greater than someone who conquers a city. Imagine hearing those words from the mouth of a king who ruled armies and commanded battles. Solomon understood the power of military strength, yet he valued something even greater: the ability to rule one's own heart. Conquering cities might impress the world, but conquering one's own anger is far more difficult. Anger itself is not always wrong. It often arises from real hurt or injustice. But Proverbs reminds us that if we allow anger to rule us, it begins to control our words and actions. A person who gives full expression to rage may feel powerful in the moment. Yet, wisdom sees something different. Proverbs says that fools give full vent to their anger, but the wise bring calm in the end. Solomon likely learned this lesson through countless experiences as a leader. As king, he would have faced betrayal, disputes, and endless conflict. A moment of uncontrolled anger could lead to decisions that affected entire nations. Most people today may not rule kingdoms, but anger still carries consequences. It can damage friendships, break families, and wound hearts in ways that linger long after the moment has passed. That is why Proverbs repeatedly calls for self-control. Yet self-control is not something that appears overnight. It requires humility, patience, and dependence on God's help. Another proverb explains that wisdom produces patience, and it is a person's glory to overlook an offense. Those words challenge us to pause before reacting, to step back from the heat of the moment and respond with understanding rather than impulse. This kind of restraint is not weakness. In fact, Proverbs treats it as a form of honor. It reflects something about the very character of God. Throughout Scripture, God is described as slow to anger and rich in mercy. Again and again, humanity fails, rebels, and turns away, yet God responds with patience and grace. Proverbs invites us to mirror that same patience in our own relationships. When we choose self-control, we are not merely managing our emotions. We are choosing love over wrath, wisdom over impulse. Still, Proverbs also recognizes that anger itself is not entirely evil. There is such a thing as righteous anger, a deep reaction to injustice, cruelty, or oppression. But even righteous anger must be handled with wisdom. Without self-control, even justified anger can lead to destructive actions. Hemmed in ancient writings like Shirach, another voice of wisdom, echoes this message. It reminds readers that holding on to anger while seeking God's healing is a contradiction. Forgiveness and mercy must replace resentment if the heart is to experience peace. In many ways, this teaching feels almost countercultural today. Modern society often encourages people to express every emotion instantly. Anger can become a badge of honor, a way of asserting dominance or proving strength. Banda. Yet Proverbs offers a completely different picture. Real strength, it says, is not found in unleashing anger, but in mastering it. A hot-tempered person stirs up conflict, but the patient person calms a quarrel. Imagine how different the world might look if that wisdom guided our reactions. Think about how many arguments could dissolve before they begin, how many relationships could heal simply because someone chose patience instead of retaliation. In moments of anger, Proverbs teaches that every person faces a choice. We can escalate the fire, or we can bring calm. We can react impulsively, or we can respond with wisdom. And every time we choose self-control, we bring a little more peace into our own hearts and into the lives of those around us. Yet there is another image Solomon gives that captures the danger of uncontrolled emotion with striking clarity. He compares a person without self-control to a city whose walls have been broken down. In ancient times, city walls were the first line of defense. Without them, a city was exposed and vulnerable to attack. Anyone could enter. Chaos could break out without warning. Solomon uses this image to describe what happens when people lose control of their emotions. Without self-control, our hearts become exposed in the same way. Anger, impulse, and temptation can enter freely, leading us into words and actions we later regret. But when we build the walls of discipline around our hearts, we protect ourselves from that destruction. And that idea of discipline leads Proverbs into yet another powerful truth. A truth about how growth, wisdom, and transformation often come through correction rather than comfort. Imagine a young apprentice standing in a workshop beside a master craftsman. The apprentice is eager, confident, and convinced that he already understands the tools in his hands. He swings the hammer quickly, cuts the wood with enthusiasm, and proudly steps back to admire his work. But the master quietly shakes his head. The cut is crooked. The angles are wrong. The structure will not hold. At that moment, the apprentice faces a choice. He can grow defensive, insisting that his work is good enough, or he can listen to correction. If he rejects the master's guidance, he may protect his pride for a moment, but he will never become a true craftsman. If he accepts the correction, even when it feels uncomfortable, his skill begins to grow. This simple picture reflects one of the most important teachings found throughout the Book of Proverbs: the difference between those who welcome correction and those who reject it. Again and again, Solomon explains that wisdom is not measured by how much a person already knows. Instead, wisdom is revealed by how someone responds when they are corrected. One proverb says it plainly: whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but whoever hates correction is foolish. At first glance, that statement may sound harsh, yet Solomon is pointing toward a deep truth about human nature. Most people enjoy learning new ideas when those ideas feel comfortable, but correction is different. Correction exposes mistakes. It challenges our pride. It forces us to admit that we were wrong, and that is why so many people resist it. But according to Proverbs, correction is one of the greatest gifts a person can receive. Without it, mistakes repeat themselves. Bad habits grow stronger. a person continues walking down a path that may eventually lead to destruction. Tumdi, another proverb, explains this principle using a vivid image. It says that whoever ignores discipline despises themselves, but whoever listens to correction gains understanding. Think about that carefully. Ignoring correction may feel like protecting our pride, but in reality it harms us. It prevents growth and blocks the wisdom that could transform our lives. Tained. This is why Proverbs often contrasts two types of people, the wise and the foolish. The foolish person rejects instruction. They assume they already know enough. When someone offers guidance, they treat it as an attack rather than a gift. Over time, their arrogance isolates them from the very wisdom that could help them succeed. The wise person responds differently. Panned. When they are corrected, they pause, they reflect. Even if the correction feels uncomfortable, they consider the possibility that it might contain truth. And because of that openness, they continue growing in understanding. Dominance. Solomon captured this contrast in another memorable line: rebuke a wise person, and they will love you. But rebuke a fool, and they will hate you. Dumdia. That sentence reveals something fascinating about human relationships. The same correction can produce two completely opposite reactions depending on the heart of the person receiving it. The fool feels insulted, the wise person feels grateful. M-U-G. This teaching appears not only in Proverbs, but throughout the wider biblical tradition. The Book of Hebrews in the New Testament reflects on the same principle when it speaks about God's discipline. It says that the Lord disciplines those he loves, just as a father corrects the child he delights in. At first, that idea may seem strange. Discipline and love do not always appear connected. But Proverbs invites us to see correction from a different perspective. Just as a loving parent guides a child away from dangerous behavior, God's discipline is meant to shape our character and guide us toward wisdom. Without correction, growth becomes impossible. Imagine a teacher who never corrects mistakes. Students might feel comfortable in the moment, but they would never learn the skills they need. Or imagine an athlete who refuses coaching. Without guidance and correction, their potential would remain unrealized. In the same way, God uses correction to refine human character. Another proverb, offers a powerful metaphor to explain this process. It says that iron sharpens iron, and one person sharpens another. When two blades rub against each other, friction occurs. The process is not smooth or effortless, yet that friction produces a sharper edge. Likewise, honest conversations, correction, and accountability sharpen the human heart. Friends who challenge each other to grow become instruments of wisdom in one another's lives. But Solomon also warns that ignoring correction carries serious consequences. One proverb describes someone who repeatedly refuses discipline and suddenly faces destruction that cannot be repaired. Mandats. It is a sobering warning. Life offers countless opportunities to change direction before mistakes become disasters. Correction acts like a signpost along the road, alerting us when we are heading toward danger. When those warnings are ignored again and again, eventually the consequences become unavoidable. Yet the tone of Proverbs is not meant to be discouraging. It is an invitation to humility, and an invitation to growth, an invitation to become the kind of person who seeks wisdom rather than defending pride. When we begin to welcome correction, something remarkable happens inside us. Instead of fearing mistakes, we begin to see them as opportunities for learning. Failure becomes a teacher rather than a permanent identity. This mindset transforms the way we approach life. It turns setbacks into stepping stones. It turns criticism into guidance. And it turns humility into strength. Solomon understood that a teachable heart is one of the most valuable qualities a person can possess. Knowledge alone does not create wisdom. Wisdom grows in hearts that remain open, humble, and willing to learn. But as Proverbs continues unfolding its wisdom, it moves from the idea of correction towards something even more profound. And it begins to talk about the power of influence. Because whether we realize it or not, the people we surround ourselves with shape the direction of our lives. One proverb states this truth with striking clarity: walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm. Think about how simple yet powerful that statement is. Human beings absorb the habits, attitudes, and values of those around them. Friendships are never neutral. They quietly influence our decisions, our character, and even our destiny. Imagine two paths again. On one path you walk beside people who pursue wisdom, integrity, and growth. Their conversations challenge you to think deeper. Their example encourages discipline and humility. Over time, their influence lifts you higher. On the other path, you walk beside people who dismiss wisdom, mock discipline, and chase only short-term pleasure. Their influence slowly pulls your priorities in a different direction. Land of Proverbs reminds us that the difference between these two paths can shape the entire course of a life. Yet influence does not only come from friendships. It also flows from mentors, leaders, family members, and even the voices we choose to listen to each day. Every voice we allow into our lives is shaping something inside us. This realization leads Proverbs toward one final and powerful truth about wisdom. Wisdom is not hidden from humanity. It is not locked away for scholars or kings alone. Instead, Proverbs describes wisdom almost like a voice calling out in the streets, inviting anyone who will listen to learn. The image is striking. Wisdom stands at busy intersections, at city gates, and in public places, calling out to the crowds. It invites the simple, the inexperienced, and even the foolish to turn toward understanding. In other words, wisdom is available to anyone who is willing to seek it, but there is a catch. Many people ignore the invitation. They rush past the voice of wisdom, distracted by pride, pleasure, or the illusion that they already know enough. And Proverbs warns that rejecting wisdom carries consequences. Not because wisdom desires punishment, but because ignoring truth eventually leads to harm. Yet the invitation remains open. Anyone who chooses humility, who listens to correction, who surrounds themselves with wise influences, and who trusts God above their own understanding, can step onto the path of wisdom. And according to Proverbs, that path leads somewhere remarkable. It leads to life. But the book ends with one final portrait. A portrait that reveals what wisdom looks like when it is fully lived out in a human life. It is the picture of a person whose character, work, relationships, and faith all reflect the beauty of wisdom in action. And that final portrait might be one of the most inspiring passages in the entire Bible.